I guess you kind of ease into it as well, because there's the long list, and then the short list. So what was that like waiting when you were on the long list? Like, how long do you until you find out you're on the short list?
Well, it's a, again, like the time was pretty compressed. So it's like, I think from the time like the long list was the announced to the kind of like finalists was only a few weeks. So I just got to be kind of delightfully anxious rather than like strenuously anxious. It just kind of wasn't long enough for me to like fully adjust, which was really good. But also, and this is corny for sure, but like I felt like the second I was longlisted that like I had won. You know what I mean? Like the good thing had kind of already happened, and I felt like that at kind of every stage. It's like, wow, to just be like mentioned on this platform is really amazing. And then like, okay, to have made the shortlist is like really incredible. And then to, as soon as it was going to be taken to the show, it was like, if I get voted off first, I still don't care. Like, this is amazing. You know, I get to do this. I get to have this whole experience. And again, like, I know that might be kind of dorky, but I kind of, every kind of step of it felt like winning. So.
Well, I can imagine. I can't imagine really. Because I mean, I'm looking at my copy of your book, and it has like the nice little candidate reads like right on it. And like, I just can't imagine what that must feel like. It's probably an amazing feeling to publish something, but then to have this massive acknowledgement where people are like, you know, glued to your book for this period. And I was listening to your interview with Paul, and I really liked that interview, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
It was lovely. One of the things that you said in the interview is that you've heard from folks that don't normally gravitate to that genre did. And like, that for me was my experience, is that I'm reading all the Canada reads because that's what I'm going to do. And yours was my absolute favorite. And I was so happy that it was. And I think that's one of the amazing Canada reads, is that you might, and with book clubs, is that they might not normally gravitate to. And yours, I absolutely adored for so many reasons. And I was listening to an interview today that you did, I believe it was on the next chapter. And you said, sorry, my internet's going out. And the interviewer said it's an action comic written by a poet. And I thought that was really interesting. That's what the viewer said to you. And when she said that, I was like, oh my goodness, yes, that's exactly what it was like. Because the pictures that you created through your words, like, it was so visual, and I just got into this whole world. And yeah, thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. That's like, it's so lovely to hear. Literally any time anybody enjoys it, you know, that will forever be my favorite thing in the entire world. And yeah, when it got on Canada Reads, I think I had that exact experience with a lot of people who were like, I may not have ever picked this up or known this would be something I would like. Like, I wouldn't have assumed this was for me based on, you know, whatever. But they did, and they really liked it. And that kind of unexpected connection, I think, is really lovely and really, really special. And, you know, like, I got a whole bunch of people who had read my books were suddenly like, my mom has read your book now. Or like, you know, my coworkers who like I never thought would be into this sort of thing, like, definitely read it just because it was on the list, and they really, really loved it. And I think that that's kind of the like, that's really I mean, there's so much value, but like, for me, that was really the value, just like getting so many people to give it a chance who might not have, or who just like might have not come across it otherwise, was just like, that was sort of the real win there, or the real like special thing there, was again seeing so many people who wouldn't have read it suddenly got to, and a lot of them liked it.
Yeah, no, I told everyone to read it, and people with like vast interest in reading, and everyone loved it. They're like, oh my goodness, So my friends who often read those types of books loved it, and who don't, they loved it. Like, it was just so broad, the spectrum.
It's very
so
cool.
Yeah, I can't, that must feel really good.
It absolutely does, for sure.
So one of the reasons why when writing the book list for this year, one of the reasons why, and when I was doing the one for Norfolk, was why we picked this book was because of this one, the way it looks at work. And for me, I'm a huge, like, I'm really into our relationship to work. That's one of my own I have. And then it was also, I said it in one of your interviews, but I don't know which one it was now. But you were talking about, you know, this whole discussion of power and authority and who gets to define justice. And so for me, as a labor worker, and, you know, how people are experiencing inform with justice is very, there's a lot of systems at play, and there's a lot of factors at play. So that's one of the reasons I was drawn to your book, was for that. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that whole piece about, you know, what is justice, and connecting that work to the real work, the real world work experience, and the whole piece of the book, the book.
Sure thing. I'll start with the work part of it, because that very much comes from, shall we say, a personal and real place. I had, you know, I had the experience of kind of really coming into the working world in the sort of like mid-aughts, and finding, like a lot of people who, you know, started looking for a job around 2005 to 2008, that a lot of the opportunity we were promised just wasn't there. There was sort of like a very, you know, and I, like a lot of my friends and peers and colleagues, instead of, you know, kind of wandering into this like bright new world full of internet opportunities, instead found a lot of extremely predatory and work situations that took advantage of a lot of us. And, you know, I had a lot of experiences of like being surrounded by these absolute hilarious geniuses, right, who deserved so much better than everything that they got. You know, and being, and that feeling of really being like trapped in that kind of a like situation. I also got to witness firsthand like how that capitalism, like, or that capitalist engine, I guess, really can force you to compromise your moral center in ways that, you know, I think all of us were really, really uncomfortable with. But there's a point at which, like, I need to pay rent and I need to eat, and is working for an oil company actually worse than working for a supervillain? Arguably, no, you know, like and you know, like or an insurance company or an arms manufacturer, right? And there's, you know, I realized that, again, like sort of during that same period of time in my life, that, like, you know, that respectability politics were often much more important to, you know, kind of like the world at large than the actual good or evil somebody was doing. So again, like, if you work for like a medical insurance company in the States, and, you know, your job is, you know, denying people cancer treatment all day, but it's perfectly legal, and you know, wear nice clothes and commute in a decent car, like you are like a good person doing well in the world. Whereas, like, if you are a, you know, like weed dealer who just like plays Xbox all day and helps somebody with their anxiety, and like you've never heard a fly in your life, like that person is a criminal. Right. And just like these things didn't, you know, there's 1,000 examples around me all the time of like the way we think about work and we think about ethics, and the ethics we're forced to compromise because we need to work. And, you know, I was very lucky. I didn't go through that period of time, like, you know, with kids or with any kind of dependent. Like, I just kind of had to like basically feed and clothe myself, and, you know, be a early 20s disaster human, right? Like, I had it pretty easy. But like, if you know, a lot of people around me didn't. Like a lot of people were, you know, like had kids involved or had people who counted on them, and you have to make very different decisions about like what you can and will do, and that's not always guided by your moral center. It's guided by necessity. So a lot of that definitely kind of got like poured into the ethical core of the book, and you know, it was definitely like aimed pretty pointedly at some like unpleasant experiences I had had, and the kind of like massive disappointment I felt in a lot of the systems that were there to protect me, which I think is probably a good jumping off point to the justice piece, which is so I'm going to kind of come at this from the side a little bit. I sort of believe that most comic books are just Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen, like over and over again, in that you have characters who are standing in for ideas. You know, you have like, yes, there are characters, yes, they have names, yes, they're people, but they're really like the physical manifestation or like the anthropomorphization of an idea. So you have like a character who is standing there for justice or for patriotism or for hope or whatever, much in the same way, you know, that's how the Fairy Queen functions. You know, you have like the Red Cross Knight, who is that kind of like representation of like chivalry and holy goodness, and he's a character and a person, but like really he's this idea, and when he like fights a monster, he's fighting sin, like he's fighting actual evil. So it's really about like these two ideas colliding, not these two characters. And I think with, you know, with comic books, you often get the same thing, right? You get a hero who's like the spirit of justice or the spirit of vengeance, kind of doing battle with these big ideas around them. So you get, you know, kind of like frail, fallible human people who are actually trying to like embody an ideal. And that works if those ideals are solid, but of course they never are, right? You know, it's one thing, you know, to have like a hero who's the embodiment of justice if that justice is like actually applied equally and, you know, with true fairness or impartiality or whatever it is. But all of us have incredibly different experiences of justice and what that looks like, and there are different justices for different people, depending on like everything from, you know, what like your race and age and, you know, sexual orientation and how much money you make. Like we all kind of know like there are different justices for all of us depending on kind of like what various demographics we like sit at the center of, and those things don't, like, I think, you know, those kind of big comic book ideas that where you kind of like can have like, well, pure justice doesn't always translate to the kind of messiness and all the failures of the real world. And I very much wanted to take that kind of comic book structure, and see what happened when you threw a world that was just as messy as ours at it, and you really tried to engage with that, you know, the profoundly like problematic and unequal ways in which those ideas are applied, because comic ideals kind of break down very quickly when you put them into that environment. But I do think what emerges is very, very interesting. So that was, you know, that kind of like unfortunately realistic, not like necessarily realistic, but like in terms of our current Earth, you know, that kind of like, I wanted to bring that, that sense of, I've often described the world in Hench as like just adjacent to ours, you know, like obviously that they're not perfect one-to-one correlations or anything. Like we don't have superpowers, but we definitely have billionaires who are like trying to shoot people into space. So like our world is definitely just as weird and broken, just in slightly different ways, you know, and we definitely still have technology that's indistinguishable from magic. We have, you know, like, yeah, billionaire playboys who do ridiculous things, and like, you know, the nightmare of Amazon, like all of those things could be a comic book, right? Absolutely 100%. So it's just slightly different. It just makes it a little bit less familiar, so we can kind of recognize how weird it is, instead of that kind of like, oh, we've just been I'm trying to defamiliarize the world, I guess is what I'm trying to say, because we're surrounded by this sort of cosmic absurdity so much, it doesn't really like clock as weird. But if you kind of move it like slightly to the side, you get that weirdness again. You can really like find the texture of that weirdness again, and I hope bring some of that back with you when you're sort of looking critically again at the world around you.
Yeah, I have so many questions now to ask you. So I was like, there's different points from like,
that was a big answer. I realized.
No, and it was an amazing answer. So thank you. I was just, now my brain is just like, whew, it's ready to go. I think I guess one of the things that I was thinking when you're talking about billionaires shooting people off into space, it kind of made me think of, do you call it disaster economics, or what do you call that? Like so how did you come, because I mean, when you look at billionaires and yes, there's some that give money, but then there's other pieces.
Oh, we just shouldn't have them. Like, it's just a terrible idea, straight up. Like, it shouldn't be a thing.
Yeah. So it's but when people try to say, well, they give money to this and give money to that, well, if you're going to start taking these other pieces, I mean, obviously this is a very complicated, or not complicated, problematic piece. Like, but I've heard people say that, well, they give money to things, but I'm like, yeah, but if you're to start doing the calculation of the destruction, like low wages, environmental, like all that. Right. So how did you, so that's what you made me think of that piece of your book about calculating the calculation part, the economic part of your book. How did, are you into economics, or is that something that you just came into as you're creating your story? Or
yeah, that was something that so the math is real. I am very pleased to tell you. Dr. Ilan Noy is absolutely a real person who very generously gave me permission to cite him in this very weird book. But the kind of the daily system, or the disability adjusted life years calculations, are incredibly complex, and again, like generally applied to like natural disasters, right? Like, what is the human cost of this tornado? How do we measure that? And it's a really fascinating set of math. I wouldn't actually say that I'm and maybe I need to like reevaluate how I think about myself, but I wouldn't necessarily say that like on the surface I'm like interested in economics so much as I am interested in the cost of things, and I am interested in like, what can we actually measure? And I find it kind of endlessly fascinating what we choose to measure and what we don't choose to measure, and also where those calculations come from. And I'm really interested in the way that statistics or data gets. I'm probably more interested in data than anything else. I think like that's fair, and I'm especially interested in the way data kind of gets broken. In the way that like we build a engine to take in data and spit out parole recommendations, for example, for prisoners who are up for parole, with the idea that like, well, this will be more impartial, right? Like we will build a system that doesn't bring our human biases in, but it's programmed with those human biases, so it ends up replicating them. So I'm very interested in that kind of stuff. Like, I'm interested in the way that sort of there is no perfect data, and all the systems that we create, kind of, if we aren't exceedingly careful, do just end up like replicating all the garbage that we bring to it. But anyway, yeah, I in looking for ways to calculate, like, because I've always kind of suspected that superheroes are worse for the world than assuming that they were real, that they would be in fact worse for the world than the good that they would do. Like, that just was sort of like the internal math my mind was kind of running in the background. It's like, that's a lot of buildings that are on fire right now for the one supervillain you just caught and robbery you stopped. This seems weird. but I wanted to prove it, right? Before I like committed to the project, like before I sort of like, oh, superheroes are bad. Actually, I wanted to prove my own internal feeling about the situation. So I took that math, or took those sort of equations, Dr. Noy's equations, and I counted all the incidents of violence and destruction in various comic books. I used the year one comics because they're like, every story takes place over the course of a year. It's a good core sample. You know that like it's 300, the events must happen within 365 days. It might not cover everything that happens, but like it's fairly bound in, you know, like, as opposed to like finding a random week in any superhero's life is relatively different. But this was like, you know, bound by time, fairly consistent. And yeah, I was right. The damage that in fact, it like way exceeded my expectations. Like the damage the heroes did were like hundreds of times worse than either anything the villains did or even just that I expected. So that assumption is based in as close to real data as I could possibly make it. And having that kind of core of like, well, if this was real, this would be a real thing, was very important to me when I was kind of like building that out. It was important that even if the setting was fictional, any of the data / calculations that I used were as close to non-fictional as I could possibly make them, because I think those like real touch points make the fiction much more effective. They're like, you know, the thing you can hold on to while everything else, you can get away with a lot, I guess, imaginatively, if you can give like one solid piece to grip onto.
No, thank you for that. I have more questions about that.
Sure, yeah.
I'm cognizant of the time though. Does anyone have any questions? I don't want to monopolize the question area.
We can take a question break.
Does anyone have anything that they'd like to ask Natalie? Can you use the chat on yourself? Oh, I can't. Oh, the Kilmelda house? Kilmanda house, sorry.
Hey, Natalie.
Hello.
We'll talk. How you doing? We were just wondering what you're working on next, if you are at a stage yet where you want to talk about the next project.
I super wish I could. I unfortunately, I cannot talk about either of the two big things I'm working on right now. Well, I promise it is very good news. I promise they are very cool. And as soon as I can possibly announce something, I will. But I promise I am A, both very busy, and B, would love to tell you more than I am able to. But I promise, but there is stuff.
We love the book.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much.
Anyone else?
Also, as folks have a question, like don't feel free to like pop it either in the Q&A or just in the chat box, and we can always like pivot over to it.
Yes. Oh, here Robin has a question. I was going to ask about whether Natalie thought fetishization of superheroes was evidence of a broken society or lack of faith in society and justice, but I think she kind of already answered it. Superheroes are worse for the world and all of that. Smiley face.
Well, I think what's really interesting, this is a great question. This is a super good question. And I think what's super interesting is, so superheroes have been around for a really long time now. This is, you know, I think that our relationship to superheroes now are often super different from the kind of historical moment in which those superheroes emerged. So like original Batman was nothing like today Batman. Right, like the Batman who first appeared was the world's greatest detective. He was like a very like forensic files / Sherlock Holmesy, but much campier kind of character, who was like, his deal was much more the like, I'm going to use all of my vast resources to like analyze this data in a way that you know, that the police can't, or other people can't. Like, I'm gonna turn my kind of singular mind and my singular detective skills on this, which, you know, like, there were a lot of detective stories at the time, right? This was like, you know, that it kind of emerged from that moment in media. But the Batman we're much more familiar with is the kind of grim, dark reboot Batman that, you know, Frank Miller has a huge hand in creating, and certainly the like early Burton movies, and like that, even down to the aesthetic, right? You know, the original Batman like ran around in a trench coat. You know, it was very much like freelance detective, you know, new Sherlock kind of territory. Whereas, you know, the kind of like brutal physicality of Batman, as well as a lot of his trauma, both, you know, that has been inflicted on him and that he inflicts, came a lot later. And so I think that like, I think we can look less at like the fact superheroes exist, but like what our relationships to them are and continue to be, as maybe a kind of more accurate, or at least more interesting, kind of like litmus test for what's happening there. So I think that like, you know, it's not that Batman exists that is worrying so much as like, if we look at the trajectory of what Batman has become, I think we can learn some very interesting things, you know, the same way that we can look at Superman as a, you know, like the Superman who is as much Clark Kent as he is Superman is very different from the like unquestionably just Superman person that we have, or character that we have today. So I think we can learn a lot from looking at how the characters change.
That's interesting. I mean, I think that's a really interesting conversation. It can go so many different ways, because you start going into so many different people. You know, what is it that humans are lacking, or we gravitate to, and how does that shift over time?
Like, what is the wish fulfillment,
yeah.
right? Like, I think the wish fulfillment is a really big part of that, right? Like, the appeal of, you know, Batman who will like go out and kick the crap out of somebody when the police can't or won't, is that sense of like, well, justice is somehow being left undone. The system is broken, right? The system that's here to protect me does not work. So I need something else, even if that something else is scary. That's just obviously like a super simplified reading from only one perspective. But that's definitely like part of it, right? Where, you know, like all the different superheroes mean and embody something like very different, right? Like they're all kind of, you know, executing on a different kind of wish fulfillment, you know, much in the same way that like, I love Jessica Jones, the new Jessica, relatively new now, I guess, Jessica Jones series is like, had a really profound impact on me. And part of that, like part of her wish fulfillment as a superhero is like, is somebody who was strong enough to actually get away from their abusive ex and survive, no matter how powerful or convincing that person was, right? Like, she got away from the Purple Man. That's an incredible piece of wish fulfillment for anyone who has felt like trapped in an abusive relationship, or who feels like they just cannot get away from an incredibly manipulative person, or, you know, sort of like, you know, it really like digs into those ideas around like trauma bonding, and, you know, how can you get away from somebody who feels like you cannot, it feels like you cannot separate your identity from them. And like, I think that's really fascinating. And that I think that a lot of what made that show and those stories really powerful is that they resonated with a lot of people who needed exactly that wish fulfillment. Like, this is what happens if I can't get away, or this is, you know, this is what it looks like when you get away and you live. Even if like that person comes back for a little while, like you can still win. And I think we can learn like a lot about ourselves and the world around us and what matters to people by like looking at like what wishes a superhero is granting. And some of those answers are for sure going to be really troubling. Right? Like they're gonna be like really upsetting, and some of them are going to be really like lovely or poignant or, you know, meaningful in all kinds of different ways. Some are really vulnerable, but some are like super unpleasant when you look at them closely. And I'm a big fan of looking at stuff like that closely, even when it is super unpleasant. Like, I think really interesting things happen, both personally and narratively. So yeah, but that's a really good question. I think there's actually like a ton that you can learn there. And it's not just about what's broken. It's about, you know, what our very private, sometimes ugly, sometimes beautiful dreams are.
Yes. So like, speaking of that, like, because your book focuses a lot on work, and I think in your interview with Paul, he said that you created a believable world because of the presence of the mundane. So do you find that some folks are, it's not so much the wish fulfillment part that you're talking about right now, but the validating part that you're reading, that people have said to you, I'm reading this book and I feel like I've connected to this character because this is how I feel about my job, or this is what I'd like to do, or like, you know what I mean? Like, totally. Are people connecting with Anna and being like, yes, like, so have you been getting that type of feedback? Or
I feel like there are, that's a great question. I feel like there are 3 responses to Anna that I kind of see repeatedly. One is like, I am on team Anna all of the way. Like, people like read her, they see what she's going through, and they are on board right to the end. It's like they get it, they get everything that she does. There are people who super connect with Anna initially and really like her and get why she's doing everything that she's doing, but they become more and more uncomfortable with the decisions she makes and the actions that she takes. And there is a certain point where they're like, I just can't go with you on this journey anymore. Like, you know, these are all people who have finished the book, not like I can't go on you as in like I can't continue, but like I am no longer fully on board with this journey. Like, you have ethically crossed a Rubicon I cannot cross. Or 3, they just like cannot stand her at all. Like, even a little bit. Like, they just think she's terrible and a terrible person. I think all responses are valid because she's very weird and complicated, like all of us, and has very, you know, like incredibly good parts of her personality and incredibly unpleasant parts of her personality. But I think that any character that we connect with deeply is going to make us feel a thing, even if that is like, I do not like this and I don't agree. And I think that's really important. A lot of people have mentioned, like, I love mundanity. I just want to say this to begin with, like, as a subject, I actually find like the allegedly boring stuff we do every day like super fascinating. And I find the idea of the mundane superhero like so interesting, because it just presents all of these problems, like, who cleans up Spider-Man's webbing? How do you get it off a building? Like, if there's like graffiti removal like services that you can call because some like kids spray painted your storefront again, there's absolutely webbing removal services like this one, or slime or whatever, like this exists. It has to. You know, it's sort of those like that like who is mopping the floors on the Death Star, because somebody is, and all of this like remarkable, weird, magical stuff creates so many problems that have to have very boring solutions, and someone does that job. And I just find that like so interesting, right? Like so interesting. Like if there's a death ray, there's an IT guy who is the specialist in making sure the death ray boots. I want to know about that guy. Like I want to know his whole life, because it's super interesting to me, both what he does all day and how he got there, even if perhaps, especially if it's kind of boring to him, right? Because it's not, like it's pretty interesting. At least I think so. So yeah, I tend to find like the mundane under extraordinary circumstances is fascinating. And I think we all, like, especially right now, like could use some extraordinariness in their mundane. You know, like I feel, I often feel like the most boring person in the world. And, you know, obviously this is like, the book was like long done and written and sold, and like it was finished entirely. Like the copy was locked before the pandemic happened, long before the pandemic happened, in any sort of like really meaningful way. And it feels more relevant for that like mundanity piece. And I do feel like that has, like, people have connected so much with that, I think, at least in part because we're all kind of like have been trapped in our own mundanity now for like a couple of years. Like I am very, very boring now. And I like it sometimes, but I'm also like kind of acutely aware of it. And I think kind of anytime we can inject some sense of like, actually this is like, it is pretty wild that I'm in my office with my cat and I'm talking to you and all of these people are here, and like this is some Star Trek stuff right now, but it's like, yeah, am I wearing sweatpants right now? Absolutely. You know, 100% I am. Like it's also, do I do this literally every day? Also, yes, right? And so it feels special, but this is absolutely Star Trek level ridiculous that it wasn't hard. I just like carried my laptop up to the office and plugged it in and it worked in 3 seconds. Like, you know, even the fact that, you know, when there are technical difficulties, like that's so interesting because we can still do this like totally crazy thing. So yeah, sort of, I realize I ranted a little tiny bit there, but I do think that like I do find mundanity really fascinating, and I think that our individual mundanity is often like much more interesting than we give it credit for.
No, it is like, and I hadn't really thought about it until, like, there's a lot of things I hadn't thought about till I read your book. But so I just want to recognize there's on the chat. So sorry, I need to bring glasses, but I'm not. So Sandra said, I'm 83 years old. Friends in their 70s talk about how different the superheroes are now than when we were growing up. We loved them, but they embodied the same values as us. They were human, which is to your Batman piece. Totally. Jackie said, excuse me, Jackie said when we were talking about the cleaning up piece, that's all I think about watching any of the movies, who cleans up everything. And Roxanne said, so funny, my daughter and I are constantly wondering who does those jobs and what they get paid.
Right, like who, Hench basically emerged from exactly that, from watching like so many movies where there's all these like, everybody's like on a computer in the background or like with a clipboard. I'm like, what is their job? Why are they doing this? Like, how did they get here? Or like, who are all these henchmen who are like following this villain around? They're all wearing ridiculous outfits. They seem to have like a very specific skill set. Like, why can you both like combat, ice skate, and crack a safe? And like, how did you get hired to work for Mr. Freeze? Like, are you super behind in your child support? Like, I just say I have so many questions and I need to know the answers. And ultimately, nobody was answering those questions for me, so I wrote a book out of spite.
Well, I like it because it is like, even tonight when I'm putting to the Zoom, I was texting Robin and I'm emailing Zila, and like use those pieces right there. Like there's just, I don't know. Yeah, our whole lives are just one piece. But then like in the theater, or in the comic book, like the movie stuff, like have wondered, like, is anyone troubleshooting? Like when I can't get my, like when I can't get my computer to work, I have to call IT. Like, you know what I mean? Like there's troubleshooters, obviously. Like
there absolutely are. There absolutely are. And there's just like playing Galaga on the helicarrier. Yes, absolutely. This 100% happens. Like there is just no way that like some hench has not programmed like Minesweeper into the like control panel of some absurd death weapon. Like it absolutely has happened. And you know, it's the one place you can find a lot of this, relatively speaking, is in fan fiction. Like fan fiction is like super, super interesting. And in addition to like a lot of like retellings and reimaginings that involve major characters, you do often get some of that like background stuff, or at least downtime, right? Like you get to see what like Captain America and Bucky are doing when they're just hanging out for 5 minutes. You know, you get to see that a lot of those, like a lot of fan fiction is dedicated to those like quieter, more ordinary moments. And I think it comes out of that same place of fascination with like what is happening in between and how do we make all of this stuff work. And we don't get to see all those failed attempts usually. But I really wish we could.
Well, no, exactly. Yeah. 10 or 9 to 8. Does anyone have any questions? I have a couple more if no one doesn't, but again, feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat or the question and answer. Jackie?
Hi there.
Hello.
I was just wondering, like, what's your writing process? Like, do you like just go crazy and spend a couple of days like just going, or like how did you get from like, you know, this kind of out of the box idea to here's a book?
Wow, if I knew how to do that consistently, let me tell you, my life would be very different. So the first draft, I was actually at a game jam, and I had a tiny bit of downtime, and I wrote a few scenes kind of in between doing other things. And then I wrote like the first like 30,000 words in about 10 days, which I do not recommend.
Wow.
It was very bad for me, both mental health wise, and also one of my wrists just totally gave out by the end of it. But I sort of had this like brain dump period. And after which I almost didn't touch it for like a couple of years. This is not a very good or efficient way of doing things. So my, you know, and with a lot of like labor and trial and error, I try and write most of the time, like most days. And doing it is more important than doing a lot, because I find that like if I'm left to my own devices, the cycle will be like a brief period of hyper focus, during which I just ignore the entire earth and my own health and body. And then a big kind of burnout crash. And that's not good for me. It's not good for the work. It's not good for anything. So the system I have been working on for the last few years, which is much more efficient, is to have rather than a minimum word count, a maximum word count that I cannot go over, but try and write at least 5 days a week doing that. And what that cap is moves around a bit depending on like what the project is and what I'm working on. But I'm not very good at outlining, just because I tend to hate everything in the outline and change it. So I write all the way through once, then I rewrite everything again, like literally retype it, making changes as I go. And then I start working very closely with an editor and, you know, moving the big pieces around and making it book shaped after that. So it's still a bit of a disaster situation, but it's actually a lot better than it used to be.
Wow, so you've been in like Hench world for years, I guess.
Yes. Yeah, a long time.
That's awesome. I really also enjoy your hair. I just wanted to let you know that.
Oh, thank you. It needs to be redone.
That was a good question, Jackie, because that was connected to my question. So.
Oh, good.
Because I was wondering, like, connected to Jackie's, because my question was about your writing process, but also what made you decide that you wanted to write a book, because you say in your biography that, you know, it was, this is the best part of the game is cats and dogs making appearances.
Yeah, the cat is officially, she's been circling my chair, beeping at me for a little while, so I've decided that it was time to bring her up for all of you. Hello.
Oh, she's lovely.
This is
What's
Gojira.
her name?
Her name is Gojira.
Gojira? Sweet. So I guess following up to Jackie's question, how did it go? Like, did you, when your other, like, I understand that writing was part of your profession or was your profession, but like, how did you decide to go into that piece?
Right. I always knew I wanted to, and like I know that's a weird way of saying it, but like should be a writer. And a lot of I made my living for a very long time freelancing, both like fiction and nonfiction. Like, so I did a lot of like video game scripts. I did a lot of like a ton of music journalism, a bunch of video game journalism. I supported myself that way for a really long time. When it came to Hench, though, there was I briefly like went back to school in like 2014, 2015 to work on a PhD, and it was a very weird experience because I was doing a PhD in video game criticism at the exact moment Gamergate happened. It ended up being a much more complicated endeavor than I thought when I set out to do it. And that experience I had the very weird experience while I was a PhD student of walking into like a presentation at a conference, and the presentation was about me and like some criticism I had done and some very public experiences I had had online. I was sort of being used as like a case study in this, you know, at this moment. And it wasn't exactly immediately related, but it definitely kind of threw me into this like crisis of academic faith where I'm like, what side of this do I want to be on? You know, do I want to be the person who is doing the analysis, or do I want to be the person making the work to be analyzed? And for a bunch of reasons, I decided, or it became clear to me that I was much happier making the things than I was doing the analysis, that's really where my heart was, that was really, that was the experience I wanted to have. And, you know, if I was living in a world where like bad things of this caliber could theoretically like happen to me for just doing the work I wanted to do, I wanted it to be work that I like loved with my whole heart, that it was like, this is what I'm absolutely meant to be doing. And at the end of the day, like academic work or, you know, that kind of like analysis just did not have the same joy in it for me that, you know, doing creative stuff did. So it was, you know, it took me a while to come back to the book after that, but it was really like, you know, quitting the PhD, kind of like returning to the world of freelancing, and then especially creative freelancing, and spending some time on that. And then, you know, eventually like being able to focus again on my own projects was kind of the journey back to making that the kind of core of my career.
Thank you for sharing that. And I mean, thank you for coming to that realization. We all, I think, can agree that we really appreciate that you created Hench. So this is,
I think I made the right choice. I'm very happy about it.
Yeah, your choice worked out well for all of us. So thank you. Is there anything you'd like to share with us before we close? Zeal is going to close, but is there anything you'd like to share with us before we close our time?
I mean, honestly, just thank you so much for having me. This has been like a sheer delight. I love libraries so dang much, man. And I tweeted this earlier, but Anna's first name before she became the auditor was the librarian. She was the librarian first, and she gradually became the auditor, but she's always been kind of the librarian in my heart. And libraries and librarians have been some of the most passionate supporters of me and my work, and have also been like the most overjoyed by like the weird data in the book. And so which has just been delightful. So in a lot of ways, when I was a kid, like libraries kept me alive and saved my life and made my brain work in the way that it does. And I will be forever grateful for that, and also just for the like unwavering support that libraries have had for Hench. It's been really amazing. So thank you for being a part of that in whatever way you have been.